Mendel believed that every trait was controlled by two factors, and that each parent contributed one factor for each trait. In Mendel's pea plant experiments, one parent plant contributed a factor for tallness, and the other parent plant contributed a factor for shortness. But one factor showed up more than the other. How do you think Mendel explained this? Mendel proposed the principle of dominance. The principle of dominance states that one factor in a pair may prevent the other factor in the pair from showing up. Mendel called the factor that kept the other factor in the pair from showing up the dominant factor. Mendel called the factor that was kept from showing up the recessive factor. In Mendel's pea plants, the factor for tallness was the dominant factor, while the factor for shortness was the recessive factor. The factor for yellow seeds was dominant over the factor for green seeds. The factor for green seeds was the recessive factor. And the factor for smooth seeds was dominant over the factor for wrinkled seeds. Wrinkled seeds were the recessive factor. Mendel believed that if a dominant and a recessive factor combined, only the dominant factor would appear in the offspring. But, although the recessive factor would be masked, it was still there. Mendel believed recessive traits such as shortness or green seeds in the pea plant appeared only when both factors which control the trait were recessive. How do you think Mendel believed offspring would look if two dominant factors, such as tallness in the pea plant, combined? Would the offspring show the dominant trait or the recessive trait? The dominant trait, of course. Today, scientists call these factors genes, and they represent genes with symbols. Capital letters are always used to represent the dominant gene. The recessive gene is represented by the small letter of the same letter used to represent the dominant gene. Since the dominant trait in the pea plant, tallness, is represented by a capital T, the recessive trait of shortness is represented by a small t. Mendel still had to explain how a trait such as shortness, that disappeared in the first generation, reappeared in the next generation. What scientific guess or hypothesis do you think Mendel proposed to explain the disappearance and reappearance of traits such as tallness and seed color? Mendel proposed the principle of segregation. This hypothesis states that members of each pair of factors for a trait separate or segregate and then combine in new mixtures after mating. Why do you think some traits disappeared and others reappeared? When the factors, or genes, for traits come together in pairs after mating, there are new combinations. A parent plant which was short might have offspring which are tall. If a shortness factor contributed by the short plant combines with the factor for tallness contributed by a tall plant. But what happens in the next generation if two recessive factors, such as shortness in the pea plant, combine? The recessive trait will reappear. The plant will be short. If a plant that has two different factors or genes for height, one for tallness and one for shortness, is mated or crossed with a pea plant that is pure for the shortness trait, that is, both genes contain the shortness trait, what are the probable appearances of the offspring? Here are the possible combinations when the genes join together. Half of the offspring plants will be hybrid. They will have the gene for tall and the gene for short. And the other half will be pure. This means that both genes will have the trait for shortness. Let's look at another example. Yellow seed color is dominant to green seed color in the garden pea plant. If two hybrid pea plants are crossed, what will their young look like? Here is the answer. Let capital Y represent the dominant yellow trait. Let small y represent the recessive green trait. To figure out the problem, cross each letter from one side with each letter from the other side. These are the possible combinations. One will contain the two dominant factors for yellow, represented by two capital Ys. Two will be hybrid. They will contain the dominant gene for yellow seed color and the recessive gene for green seed color. And one combination will contain both recessive genes for green seed color. The first two principles, the principle of dominance and the principle of segregation, were concerned with the inheritance of single traits. However, the pea plant has many traits. How do you think the results would be affected if two or more traits were studied at the same time? Would the number of appearances of one trait, such as green seed color, have an effect on the number of appearances of another trait, such as the height of the pea plant? To find out, Mendel decided to follow two pairs of contrasting traits at the same time. From previous experiments, he knew that yellow color was dominant over green color in pea seeds, and that round seed shape was dominant over wrinkled seeds. Mendel proceeded to make crosses in which he kept track of both seed color and seed shape. He started with plants that were pure for both dominant traits. They produced yellow round seeds. The other parent was pure for both recessive traits. They produced green wrinkled seeds. He artificially pollinated one type of plant with pollen from the other type, and then observed the seeds that were produced. The results were as expected. All the seeds of the first generation showed only the two dominant traits. That is, they were yellow and smooth. No green or wrinkled seeds appeared. The next step was to plant these seeds and let the plants that grew from them self-pollinate or inbreed. This would produce a second generation of seeds. As expected, recessive traits appeared in some of these seeds. Many seeds still showed both dominant traits, but some were yellow and wrinkled. They were dominant for seed color and recessive for seed shape. Some were green and smooth. They were recessive for seed color and dominant for seed shape. And a few were green and wrinkled. They were recessive for seed color and recessive for seed shape. The traits were distributed in exactly the same ratios as when only a single trait was studied, that is, 3:1. And the number of appearances for one trait had no effect on the number of appearances of the other trait. The color of the pea seeds had no effect on whether the pea seeds were round or wrinkled, and round or wrinkled shape had no effect on whether the trait for seed color was yellow or green. From data of this kind, Mendel concluded that traits were inherited independently of one another. What hypothesis do you think Mendel used to explain this? Mendel proposed the principle of independent assortment. This principle states that factors for different traits are separated and distributed independently of one another. In Mendel's pea plants, this means that if the plant is tall, it will have no effect on the color of the seeds or the shape of the pea pods. If the principle of independent assortment were extended to human beings, it would mean that if a person has blue eyes, it will have no effect on whether the person is short or tall. To review then, Mendel believed each trait was controlled by two factors, and that each parent contributed one factor. Mendel proposed three simple hypotheses to explain the inheritance of traits. The principle of dominance states that for each factor contributed by a parent, one factor dominated over the other and appeared more often. The principle of segregation states that members of each pair of factors for a trait separate or segregate and then combine in new mixtures after mating. The principle of independent assortment states that factors for different traits are distributed independently of each other. This means that the number of appearances of one trait will have no effect on the number of appearances of another trait.